back on January 14, 2021, I had the opportunity to virtually present at the Nashville and Knoxville Microsoft 365 Users Group. That presentation was on We're Moving to Microsoft 365, Now What?, where I gave them a choice or a choose-your-own-adventure type presentation on some of the basics around getting started with Microsoft 365. They chose the path of taking a look at the various services offered in the Microsoft 365 suite and how they all fit together and work together. So for about 50 minutes, I presented on this topic. This video is a recording of that presentation. So if you would like access to the slides, drop a link in the comments below. Or if you want to check out their group for future events, the link to their meetup group is also in the video description. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and click that little bell to get more Microsoft 365 and Azure content on this YouTube channel. Now, let's dive into the presentation. We're moving to Office 365. Now, what do we do? To kind of set up Microsoft 365, why Microsoft 365, why some people are afraid of Microsoft 365, and then we will get to a point where we can kind of diverge and go two different directions. Also, as we go, feel free to post questions in the chat. I will try to keep an eye on that. I do have a few monitors, and hopefully I can at least keep somewhat of an eye on it. If I look away, I'm just looking at another monitor. Unmute yourself, ask questions too if I don't see it. I'm not opposed to being interrupted, especially when chat is like way over here and other stuff's this direction. So, why Microsoft 365? One of the ones that I love the most: no more servers, no more patching, no more hardware to deal with other than your employees' computers, no more late nights, no more installing cumulative updates on SharePoint, patching Exchange server, any of those. Along with that, now it's Microsoft's fault. If something breaks, if something goes down, you can open a support ticket. This can also be a disadvantage, but there is something nice about just being able to open a ticket, working with Microsoft to fix it. Kind of going back to what Pam said about the small teams. If you were working on a small team with a bunch of servers, sometimes you kind of feel like you have somebody else there working with you to help you fix it. Another one is the scale. I come from a SharePoint background. I am used to dealing with large SQL databases, trying to manage user growth, servers needing to be scaled up, SharePoint servers needing to be added to handle the growth. While there are limits to where the cloud can scale, it is, for all practical purposes, limitless. You can continue to scale, you can continue to add documents, it can continue to grow. And another one is you can focus on solutions and adoptions. Going back to those first three, now some people say, what am I supposed to do? I don't have servers to manage. I don't have cables to run. I don't have servers to rack. Focus on solutions, focus on adoption, focus on making the experience better for your users and solving business problems. I have really enjoyed that aspect of it, that I'm no longer worried about is it up or is it down and what's going on, but that it is, I can post this deck. And I saw, well, this would be recorded. I'm recording this on my end, so I may try to put everything together as well. Although it looks like, is my video, I might have lost my video. Nope, it is still on. My video might not be recording though. Anyways, I am trying to record some of this too. For those that asked, I might try to put it up. That may end up on my YouTube channel, or Daniel and I can work on that. Anyways, you can focus on that, solutions and options, and as of 2020, COVID was a big reason to move to Microsoft 365. The work from home, trying to get everybody working from home is one reason people have moved to Microsoft 365. Why not Microsoft 365? Kind of going back to what I said before, it's Microsoft's fault. There are times when I have also had my hands tied due to the fact that Microsoft did something, they made some change, it broke something, and I have to wait for them to fix it. I'm actually in that boat right now. There's a bug out there with SharePoint and moving files around in SharePoint Online that something happened, Microsoft broke something, and I have some clients that have the issue. We're just waiting for Microsoft to roll out the change. It is also always changing and updating. There are changes coming out weekly. If you've ever watched the Message Center that Daniel mentioned, you'll notice that there are always changes. There's always changes to keep up with, things to react to, things to handle as you roll it out to your users. It can be a challenge sometimes, and it is a subscription. It's not a buy once, always have it. This one, you'll get people arguing about it too. Is it good? Is it bad to have a subscription? It is one of those things you're always paying for. If you come from a company that is used to upgrading every 5-6 years, when support ends, and just having a one-time purchase every 5 or 6 years, this can be a change. The final one that I hear all the time is it's less secure. I would argue that is a completely invalid reason to not go to Microsoft 365. If anything, I would argue it's more secure. We won't get into all of that today, but if you are in that boat and want to have a discussion, I would love to have a discussion about that. There's lots of things you can do to really secure it down, and we might get into it a little bit, depending on which adventure everyone chooses. Another point of clarification, Microsoft 365, or is it Office 365? Microsoft uses these words interchangeably. I am going to try to stick to this definition. Office 365 is your core services. And if you get into the enterprise licenses, this is what they are. It is Exchange, it's SharePoint, it's Teams, Azure AD under the covers. That is what's included in Office 365, your desktop applications. You also have a license that's your Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite. This is Azure AD Premium, Intune, a bunch of Endpoint Manager now. Intune got renamed to Microsoft Endpoint Manager. There's a license for that. And there is also a Windows 10 E5 and E3 license. You can purchase Office 365 E3, Enterprise Mobility and Security E3, and Windows 10 E3 as 3 separate products. Or you can purchase Microsoft 365, which is a combination of those 3 products. And that is, at least in the enterprise space, the definition that still holds true between Office 365 and Microsoft 365. When you get into the business plans, where Microsoft renamed everything to Microsoft 365 Standard, Business, Premium, that definition varies a little bit. So there is some discrepancies there. But by and large, as we're going through today, I'm going to be talking mostly to the enterprise plans. Again, if you have questions, if you want to talk small business versus enterprise after the fact, feel free to let me know. Walter, definitely a tax write-off as well. So the shift from on-premises to Microsoft 365, as you're looking to go there, changes you want to take into account. This is a very high level, but this is typically what an on-premises environment looks like. You have your servers, you have your networking, you have Active Directory, and then you kind of have Exchange, you have SharePoint, you have Skype for Business, and then other software. It tends to be a very siloed type approach. The enterprises I was in, the Exchange team maybe talked to the SharePoint team, they maybe talked to the team running Skype for Business. Active Directory and networking had to be involved a little bit, but it tended to be very segmented teams. It's a little bit more of a simpler view of kind of how everything functions, how everything fits within the organization. As you move to Office 365, you're still going to have your servers. You may still have some on-premises hardware. Maybe it's servers in Azure. You still have some of the networking. You still have your local computers that are networked together, your local switches. There's still going to be some local networking. You may or may not have Active Directory. You may or may not have other software. But then you layer on Azure and Office 365 because, frankly, Office 365 as a service runs within Azure or runs on all of the Azure hardware. Then you throw in Azure Active Directory and you have Azure Active Directory Connect. That Azure Active Directory spans both Azure and Office 365. You have Azure Active Directory Connect if you want to sync your on-premises Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. And then within Office 365 as a whole, you throw in SharePoint, you throw in Exchange, you throw in Skype for Business as a service because that's still running under the covers of Teams in certain areas. You throw in the Power Platform. And then you start integrating things like security, like Cloud App Security and Advanced Threat Protection, Teams, Microsoft Information Protection, your compliance, your auditing, your data loss prevention, Microsoft Search, all of these products that really span sometimes all of Azure and Office 365, sometimes just Office 365. And then you even have a few Azure services that have a lot of hooks into Office 365, whether it's Azure Sentinel or Azure Automation or Logic Apps. So one of the shifts that I see a lot of companies struggling to make is as you get all of this overlap between services, something you do in search affects SharePoint, Exchange, Teams, something you do with data loss prevention, impacts all the services, is a need starts arising for someone to, and then Windows 10, forgot my Windows 10. That one spans it as well. You start having the need for somebody to oversee the cloud as a whole. Your Exchange and SharePoint and Skype for Business teams need to start communicating and working together a lot more because there is... The way I like to say it is Microsoft took all of these products that were always meant to be integrated together. They always wanted these to be integrated together. They have integrated them together in the cloud in a way that I have never seen achieved in an on-premises environment. So that need for communication between all of your teams that are managing email, managing SharePoint, managing Active Directory, managing Azure, they all need to come together and work a lot closer together, have a lot more open line of communication. And I would argue there needs to be a position that manages your entire cloud infrastructure as a whole. You don't have the Exchange team, the SharePoint team, and the Skype for Business team anymore. You have your Office 365 team with people within that team that have different specialties. So that's kind of the premise for setting this up. Office 365, there is a lot of services. And this is where we're going to start getting into where everybody wants to go with this presentation. Sorry, Walter, I left Microsoft Dynamics off. That's a beast in and of itself. But you're right, Dynamics ties into that as well. Especially some of the integrations now. There's getting to be more and more integrations now between Dynamics. So what do we do with all of these services? And this isn't all of them either. I grabbed as many icons as I could find from all the different services. It's a lot to keep up with. It's a lot to manage, especially kind of as this presentation implied. You're new to Microsoft 365. You're just migrating there. Maybe you've migrated to Teams or migrated to Exchange, but you want a little bit more grasp of the entire platform and everything that's included in the platform as a whole. So, I have two completely different paths we can go down at this point in time. Path A, I picked out 5 topics where there's one or more products that apply to the environment as a whole. Whether this is identity with things like Azure Active Directory, how you set up various administration because you do have all these services, how you would go about securing data across the platform as a whole, what to do about sprawl, some of the security, reporting, all of that across your entire environment. That is one direction we can go in. All those services that were kind of those green bars on the slide back, where we kind of take a look at these services that affect the path as a whole. Path B is we can go down and start looking at all of these different services. And as we go through them, look at how they start relating to each other. What is Exchange? How does Exchange fit into the Microsoft 365 platform as a whole? What about SharePoint, Lists, and OneDrive? How do those all work together? How do those work with Teams? How do those work with Exchange? How do we differentiate Teams and Yammer? And what about all these Tasks app, whether it's To-Do or the Tasks app in Team or Planner, and kind of look at all of these different individual services, what they can be used for, as well as how they integrate together. So there's a bunch of you in there. Rather than unmuting and asking everybody to fight over it, just throw in the chat if you want path A or path B, and the majority wins. And you're only allowed to vote once. You cannot vote multiple times. I am seeing B, 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 B. Okay, B is winning by far. And if you want path A, I can always come back and talk again, since Pam and Daniel are still looking. Okay, B has won. I think more than half of you have already voted for B. So I just have to find where my B slides start now within my deck. And skip past A. There it is. I think this is, oh, no, that's second to last one. All right. So let's start with Exchange. Damon said, I read all the pages in a Choose Your Own Adventure books. We were talking about that before Araki takes back the B. We were talking about those Choose Your Own Adventure books before we kind of started today. I read those as well. And that's kind of where I got that idea from. So diving into Exchange a little bit. One thing I still run into, talking to a lot of people, is I thought Outlook was my email. What's Exchange? Just to start with a simple definition, Outlook is where you're going to interact with your mail. Whether this be the desktop client, whether this be Outlook on your phone, whether this be Outlook in the browser, the web version of Outlook. Outlook is that interaction layer of your email. It's where your users are going to work with all their email, work with their calendars. I should have put that in there as well. Work with calendars, work with tasks, work with contacts. That's your front end. Exchange is where all of this stuff lives. This is where your mailboxes live, whether this be shared mailboxes or whether this be your personal mailboxes, whether this be mailboxes that are related to teams and groups in Office 365. So when we talk email, I'm going to primarily refer to Exchange. Outlook is the end user tool, just like Word, PowerPoint, Excel are. Exchange is what is actually doing the heavy lifting on the back end. As we implied, what else does Exchange do? There is a lot of people that maybe went to Teams in COVID without realizing some of the implications of just going to Teams, without also using Exchange in Microsoft 365 or Exchange in Office 365. I have one client that has started using Teams, and they did start asking me questions. Well, why doesn't this work? Or why doesn't this functionality work? Exchange is where your conversations in Teams get stored if you start dealing with document retention. So maybe it's a legal case and you need to put a legal hold on conversations that happens in Teams. Or maybe for compliance purposes, you need to retain conversations that happen in Teams and users shouldn't be allowed to delete them. If you are going to do that retention and put legal holds in place and put retention policies in place for conversations in Teams, that is going to be leveraging Exchange on the back end. Also, your calendar for Teams. This is the one question I got. If you use Teams and you notice that you can set your status, much like you could in Skype for Business, and it's set automatically based on calendar appointments, that is an interaction between Exchange and between teams. There are ways you can get that using hybrid and configuring hybrid Exchange, where maybe you have some mailboxes in your on-premises environment and you have other mailboxes in Office 365, or you at least have that hybrid connection set up properly. Microsoft provides a list out there for this is functionality that you get in Teams if you don't have any connection between Teams and your Exchange on-premises environment. This is the interaction you get if you have Teams and you have an Exchange hybrid environment, where Exchange is at least in some way connected to Office 365. And this is the functionality that you get if you have a full Exchange Online, all your mailboxes are in Exchange Online, and you've fully migrated to Exchange Online. So there are things like that automatic status update, Teams email addresses. If you have ever noticed, you can go to a channel in Teams and get an email address and send email to Teams. That's all leveraging Exchange on the back end, as well as those Microsoft 365 group mailboxes, which tie into Teams as well as Exchange. And we're going to get into Microsoft 365 groups a little bit later. I think it's when we start diving into Teams a little bit more. But there are some things with Microsoft 365 groups that there tends to be confusion around. The other thing, as you move to Office 365 and Exchange Online, is email security. This is one of those where there's not a lot of interactions between email security, but there are some of those products, looking at Path A, where some of the email security tools actually would apply to your environment as a whole. Microsoft 365, in my opinion, does have really good email security. Certain clients ask, I'm going to Exchange Online, I'm typically using Symantec for my email security on premises, or I'm using Barracuda or Cisco. You can still do that in Office 365. Most of those products, if not all of them, still have integration where we can put a Cisco umbrella in front of our Exchange Online, or we can put Symantec in front of our Exchange Online. I would argue it may or may not be necessary. Microsoft has done a lot to leverage some of the AI, some of the automation capabilities, some of the computing power that they have in Azure to really come up with a complete email security solution. Whether this is doing investigation and hunting into incoming spam messages, you can do some investigation and hunting into outgoing spam. An end user got malware on their computer that sent out a bunch of emails. All of that type of investigation, hunting, prevention is all built right into the email security and Exchange Online. The other advantage that Microsoft has is they have a lot of mailboxes in Office 365. They have a lot of clients in there. You benefit from them watching the email that comes into the entire Office 365 platform. Where a particular spammer is phishing for information from another organization, it's detected as phishing emails, and they can roll those rules out, those filters out across all of Office 365, so you can benefit from some of that as well. So they really do have a lot of email security in place as you look to go to Exchange Online. Moving on from Exchange to just kind of governance. We had started talking a little bit about Microsoft 365 groups and how those fit into all of this. When you start looking at Office 365 and starting to get into SharePoint a little bit more, you start looking at how Exchange and Microsoft 365 groups interact with the rest of the platform. And I'm going to jump to another slide because I don't like the order I put these in. So let's take that time out. Let's look at Microsoft 365 groups a little bit. Microsoft 365 groups, live in Exchange Online more or less from an administration standpoint. When you go look at groups, create groups, they're going to be in Exchange Online. But what is the Microsoft 365 group? Or they used to be Office 365 groups. This is nothing more than a membership list. There aren't services included with a group. There are people in a group. A Microsoft 365 group consists of owners and it consists of members. That's all it is. It sits on top of the infrastructure. It ties into the Microsoft Graph, and it does tie into all of these other services. So just because when you create a Microsoft 365 group doesn't mean a SharePoint site is a part of that group. It is a site that lives in SharePoint that is created at the same time you create the group and is secured by the Microsoft 365 group. Same thing goes with your emails and Exchange. That shared mailbox is connected to the Microsoft 365 group. It's not a part of the Microsoft 365 group. The downside is because they're all attached, if you delete the SharePoint site, or if you delete the planner plan, or if you delete the team that's associated with the group, everything else gets deleted as well. But a lot of people still think of those resources being included in the group, when the reality is a group is just a group of people, and that group is used to secure those resources. But going back to how they interact with things then is groups do create a SharePoint site. Within your SharePoint environment, you may have your company at the top level. You have different divisions that are maybe hub sites. You have different SharePoint sites. And with all of these different levels of SharePoint sites that are created, teams that are created, shared mailboxes that are created, you do get Office 365 groups. So as you start looking into the governance for these sites, for these Office 365 groups, for these teams, they're all connected and created together. So one thing you do have to start being aware of and thinking through as you work on these or work within your Microsoft 365 environment is, how do you want to start structuring all of this integration? How do you tie a team site that's not associated to a Microsoft 365 group, a team site that's created to an Office 365 group, or your communication sites that don't have a Microsoft 365 group? How do all of those interact together? How do those fit into that company structure as a whole to really help prevent the sprawl, prevent the growth? Because all of these things are created, even though it's not part of a group. I've got into environments where they've rolled out Teams, they've rolled out Office 365, and they go in and start creating a bunch of Microsoft 365 groups. Microsoft will try to get you to convert your distribution lists in Exchange Online to Microsoft 365 groups. All of a sudden, they end up with a bunch of SharePoint sites because as they created these groups, as they created these teams, the SharePoint sites got created as a part of that. So just an interaction there between those groups, between Exchange Online. Groups are kind of the bridge between Exchange Online and the rest of the environment in terms of kind of where they live, where you manage them, and all the other stuff they start creating along with it. So because they start creating SharePoint sites, as you create those Microsoft 365 groups, as you start to think about how everything fits together in your organization, how does SharePoint fit into all of this? SharePoint is that backend file storage for everything in Microsoft 365. If you create a file in any service in Microsoft 365, this is where your document collaboration takes place. This is where your shared content in Teams and Outlook lives. This is where files that are uploaded to Yammer live. Shortly here, stream files, all your videos are going to live in SharePoint or OneDrive. As you work with business processes, with your Power Apps, with your Flow, and you want to interact with files, that's going to live in SharePoint. And this is also that access to files using the OneDrive client. It's going to interact with SharePoint. SharePoint is also starting to tie into those other areas within Office 365. You start looking at Project Cortex, bringing in some of the AI functionality. Some of the labeling, there's starting to be automatic labeling in SharePoint for sensitive information, for retention policies. That's starting to tie into some of the AI functionality. And then the security of your SharePoint groups. This kind of brings us full circle back to those Microsoft 365 groups. Security in save time. All right, Rocky has a question to save for the end. Security in SharePoint ties back to Azure AD, ties back to those Microsoft 365 groups, where now if you start adding people into Microsoft 365 groups, they're getting access to a SharePoint site. Or in order to give people access to a SharePoint site, you add them to a Microsoft 365 group. Well, this doesn't always hold true. More and more, that's getting to be that's getting to be kind of the standard, the de facto standard within Microsoft 365 is let's manage the security for all the things, including SharePoint, in Microsoft 365 groups. And then finally, you do have some of the extensibility of SharePoint. Some of this will start being surfaced as we start looking at Teams in a little bit, whether you want to do some custom development and use the SharePoint framework, whether you want to take SharePoint and extend it with things like Power Apps for creating custom forms, or with Power Automate for building flows to automate certain tasks, to automate document approvals within SharePoint, creating all those business processes that interact with files and lists within SharePoint. Another thing within SharePoint I wanted to bring up, because it's a shift. If you've done SharePoint on premises, you're moving to SharePoint online. Hub sites. Hub sites can be a really powerful feature in SharePoint that not everybody's taking advantage of. Hub sites don't really integrate into a lot of the other services. It's just one of those things I wanted to bring up. You start getting the mega menu options, kind of like you can see on this slide, where you can build out larger menus that span multiple sites. That happens all across a hub site. All of the sites associated to a hub site get that navigation. So when you think of hub sites in SharePoint, think of I have a central site, and then I have all of these spokes coming off that central site. A hub site is the central one. You can associate any other site collection in SharePoint to a hub site. So it's a one-to-many relationship. You cannot associate a site to multiple hub sites. But with these hub sites, you get things like searching across a hub site and all of the sites associated with it. You can roll up news from those children's sites to a parent hub site. As you start deploying content types in SharePoint, if you've used those, now you have the ability to say these content types get deployed to this hub site and all of the associated hub sites at the same time. And the big shift that starts happening when you look at hub sites is now everything is a site collection. SharePoint on premises, you used to have a site collection. You could put subsites off of it. As you get going with SharePoint, I really encourage everyone, if they have a history with SharePoint, forget about subsites. Everything is its own site collection. When you create a team, it gets a site collection. When you create a Microsoft 365 group, it gets a site collection. If you go down the route of a site collection and subsites in SharePoint, as you get going and as you spin it up, you're probably going to end up regretting it later on. Microsoft Lists. This is an interesting one. I took part in a Facebook conversation about this earlier this morning. Microsoft Lists is a SharePoint list. If you start talking about Microsoft Lists, we're going to roll out Microsoft Lists. We're going to start using Microsoft Lists from a management administration perspective, a Microsoft list is just a SharePoint list. It lives either in a SharePoint site or it lives in your OneDrive. But at the end of the day, it lives in a SharePoint. It is just a new central UI as well as a new skin on top of a SharePoint list. It does provide some simplification, some filtering, some additional benefits around formatting columns. But again, as you think about, I'm new to Microsoft 365, I see all these things about Microsoft List. It is just a SharePoint list. And I'm going to show you a little bit because this is always one of those interesting demos where you can show people. And they're like, huh. So if I go to, let's just start at portal.office.com. Portal.office.com. And hopefully I'm logged in. And I go into my tenant, and great, I have my lists here. I have Microsoft lists. For whatever reason in my tenant, it always shows up blank until I refresh it a second time, and then usually my list starts showing up. If it refreshes. I don't know the reason for it, and I haven't spent the time to figure it out. So hopefully it'll come up fairly quickly here. Working, there it goes. So I have all of these lists here. Let's go into my test list for Microsoft lists. So here's a Microsoft list. I can go add new items. I can configure it. What you'll notice in the URL is it's going to my SharePoint site/site/demo test list. At the end here, it has this question mark environment web view list. If I simply cut that off the end of it and refresh it, and apparently my tenant wants to go really slow this morning, I will end up in my normal SharePoint site and a normal SharePoint list just because of the query string on the end of it. I can just as easily, where I went into site contents, I pulled up a SharePoint list. If I paste that right on the end of that, all of a sudden, I end up back in my Microsoft Lists view with my SharePoint list rendered as a Microsoft list now instead of a SharePoint list. You may also notice this if you go into SharePoint and create new lists. So if I would go back into site contents and add a new list here, I get this nice little dialog box where I can do blank lists. I have all of my templates. This is that exact same dialog that you get if you're in your Microsoft lists and you click to create a new list here. Again, a Microsoft list is a SharePoint list. You're going to end up with some of the same limitations, some of the same restrictions, but don't think, Alexa's listening to me, don't think that these lists that are getting created in Microsoft lists are getting stored in some hidden spot or getting stored in some other service. It is just using SharePoint on the back end for the lists. And that is why if you do go create a new list too in SharePoint or in Microsoft lists, you're forced to choose a site because it just has a SharePoint list that it creates in the site. If you choose My Lists, it just creates it in your OneDrive as a list in your Microsoft OneDrive. So let's jump back to the slides and hopefully it transitions. Back to my slides. Somebody interrupt me right away if you can't see my slides. And I've lost my Teams window with the chat too, so definitely unmute and interrupt me. OneDrive, okay, perfect. So OneDrive, the way I've started thinking about OneDrive as it relates to SharePoint and Office 365 is the central location for all things files. Where you can start getting some confusion, and one thing you do need to really work with users to differentiate between is the whole OneDrive for Business, kind of the service, versus the OneDrive client. And as I've worked with end users, a lot of times people will just say OneDrive. And you really want to gain some clarification there and some understanding and help your users understand how that works. OneDrive for Business is that personal location in Microsoft or in Office 365 where you store your personal files in those My Lists, as we just looked at. It is a SharePoint site. If you worked with SharePoint in the past, it was the My Site version of SharePoint. It is just another SharePoint site, but that OneDrive for Business service is where all of your files are stored, where those lists are stored. And then you also have the OneDrive client. This is what gets installed on Windows 10, on Mac OS. It could be the iOS app, the Android app. And this is that client that you use to connect and sync to either OneDrive for Business to sync personal files, get the files on demand experience, or you can sync to those SharePoint document libraries to also pull SharePoint files down to your local desktop. Where a lot of people end up getting confused is, I save this file to OneDrive. Well, if you have OneDrive syncing to SharePoint and you have it syncing to OneDrive for Business, you really want to work to help them understand, well, did you store it to SharePoint or did you store it in OneDrive for Business? They may just say they put it in that sync client on their desktop. Some other nice features about OneDrive is the web version of OneDrive. You can now leverage that to actually navigate through files in your SharePoint sites. This is another one of those where I'll just pull it up really quick a minute. If you are back in your browser and we'll cancel this list creation. And you're in OneDrive, if you're working with your files, and this is why I say OneDrive is quickly becoming the one-stop shop for all the files, you'll also have those SharePoint lists listed down the left side here, or SharePoint sites, where I can go into the site for our podcast and actually navigate through all of those files in the podcast SharePoint site, even though I'm in OneDrive. And this is another point too where users could get confused is I may say, well, I uploaded this file from my desktop to OneDrive because I'm in OneDrive, but it's really going to that podcast SharePoint site. I just navigated to it through OneDrive. So again, as you roll out Microsoft 365, as you start introducing users to it, getting that clarity on the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint, the client and the web service, and kind of how OneDrive and SharePoint interact with each other when it comes to those different files. Bridging the gap into search now. SharePoint search used to kind of be that main search service within Microsoft 365. That's what you would use to search for files, to search for anything in SharePoint. You'd have to use Outlook or Outlook on the web if you wanted to search your email. Maybe you'd have to use Teams if you wanted to start searching for things in Teams. Microsoft 365 Search is one of those that they continue to iterate on. It continues to expand. It really started off as the modern search experience to kind of replace SharePoint Search. But as you can see, it's starting to now be, this is Microsoft Search. This is what you use to search all of Microsoft 365 or all of Office 365. I will tell you it's not fully there yet. But the configuration of this is different too, because now a lot of the Microsoft Search configuration and your search configuration for the search that you'd use in SharePoint is moving out of your SharePoint Admin Center into your Central Admin Center, where now you configure a single search experience across the entire platform. This is even moving into Windows 10, where if you have Windows 10 connected to your Office 365 environment, if you're kind of in that Microsoft 365 environment where you have Office 365, you have Windows 10, you have EMS all tied together, no matter where you search, this is going to search all the services. It's going to search your files. It's going to search your email. It's going to search for sites. Microsoft has said this is going to start searching all of your Teams conversations. So you can start having your one-stop location to search all things Microsoft 365. Again, this is still a work in progress. There are still times when I most definitely still search just Outlook or just Teams. It does really well with SharePoint. But one of those services that does kind of bridge the gap and start spanning all the different services, and one of those you want to go start configuring. There's a lot of different configuration options in Microsoft Search in terms of Q&A. So you can redirect people to a specific location if they search for something like a time off request form, or if they're searching for employee benefits. This is the site you go to find the employee benefits, or this is the site you go to for open enrollment. There's more and more of that functionality to really help you fine-tune that search experience in Microsoft 365. So your users, your employees, your team members can get to the information they need. Jumping into Teams a little bit. Teams is interesting. This is probably one of those that I still see as being it's misunderstood a lot in terms of how everything works in Teams. It's getting better. But there's still a lot of questions that I run into when companies deploy Teams, kind of going into how we started with Exchange, and it's a backend for some of the Teams stuff. When you start looking at Microsoft Teams, you have your Teams clients. You have the one that runs on your desktop. You have the one in the browser. Underneath that is a bunch of these Microsoft 365, Office 365 platforms and services that we've already talked about. You have SharePoint under the covers. You have Exchange under the covers. I believe Teams uses 21 different Azure services under the covers, and it still uses Skype for Business. Some of the infrastructure for Skype for Business, particularly around voice calls, still is leveraged as Teams. So there's a lot of things under the covers of Teams where there are some of the services that are unique to Teams. Some of the way that conversations work, they really overhauled a lot of the way the screen sharing works in Teams. So there are some Team services, but it really does leverage a lot of those Office 365 services under the covers. There it goes. Teams clients. We talked about that. So the Microsoft 365, your Azure AD admin, those tools. Like we said, this is where you control those groups. This is the identity for your teams. All of your users, your groups, your licensing, your access to Teams is all controlled within Azure AD. That's one of those components that's getting used. Like we said, Teams, Skype for Business. There used to be a Teams and Skype for Business admin center. This is slowly Skype for Business as a product and in label has gone away. There is still a lot of Skype for Business. The old infrastructure, not something you have to be aware of, just kind of interesting tidbits. And then you do have security and compliance. This is where, again, had we gone down path A instead of path B, there are a lot of security and compliance admin tools that control security and compliance across Microsoft 365 as a whole, looking at some of the data loss prevention and labeling. But that's another one of those where that integration is there. It's a part of Teams, but it's also part of Exchange for labeling emails. It's a part of SharePoint for labeling SharePoint sites and labeling documents within SharePoint. Or again, your data loss prevention, where those policies can apply to Teams, to SharePoint, to Exchange, to all these different products. So there's a lot of those security and compliance tools within the admin center for controlling the content in Teams and what actually is going on within Teams. And then you start getting Teams where it integrates with everything. This is also another one of those shifts that I've seen over the last year, where when I used to build on environments, a lot of people wanted to start in SharePoint. Let's make SharePoint our landing spot for going and getting the news, for getting information, for getting links. When people come in, we want them to open up their browsers and go to SharePoint. I was working with a client, it was actually probably about a year ago, maybe a little longer ago, where we took that approach. And all of a sudden we got to a certain point, and they're like, well, now I want to integrate conversations into my SharePoint environment. And I was like, well, it's kind of hard. I mean, we could maybe like embed Yammer in it, but ultimately what they wanted was to start something like Teams, and now let's put everything else into Teams. And as Teams has grown over the last year especially, and continues to grow, more and more I'm saying, well, let's actually start with Teams. And now let's put SharePoint into Teams, and let's put your Office applications into Teams. Let's put Stream in there, and Planner in there, and Power Automate and Power Apps can go in there. And now you have Dataverse that can give you some additional functionality in Teams, where it's almost like Teams is becoming the new browser for your Office 365 applications, and even for other third-party applications, where as soon as you start going into Microsoft 365, you really want to think about how Teams fits into all of this, because it affects how you create SharePoint site collections. It's going to affect possibly how you structure your different SharePoint sites, how you control your sprawl. A lot of that is all becoming central to Teams, where Teams is, let's go to Teams and let's live in Teams. I find myself doing that. Teams is always up, and I navigate to everything I need to do within Microsoft 365 by leveraging Teams. SharePoint and Teams is big. This is one that people don't seem to fully grasp all the time, and there's a lot of integration points there that really make the story really compelling, but it's also one of those things you need to understand as you roll it out. The SharePoint Home app has been announced. I have not seen it in a tenant yet, but this is going to soon give you the ability for this topmost button on the left side of Teams to be your SharePoint home. This could be now that home intranet site where people open up Teams, they land on that SharePoint home app, and that is now that intranet site for your company. You also have file integration. When you navigate to files within Teams, you are navigating to a SharePoint site. This is another one where I've had lots of conversations with people where they say, well, do my files belong in Teams or do they belong in SharePoint? Or I need to migrate my file shares to Microsoft 365. Should I migrate them to Teams or to SharePoint? There's no difference. Files in Teams are in SharePoint. If you're going to migrate a file share to Teams, you're migrating a file share to SharePoint. If you're storing files in Teams, you're storing files in the SharePoint site in the background. Super important to understand as you start looking, again, at some of the security and the integration between them and how to manage everything, is that you are working, when you talk about managing files in Teams, you're really talking about managing files in SharePoint. Another part where this really comes into play is private channels in Teams. Everybody was clamoring for private channels. We need private channels within Teams. Be aware that when you create a private channel in Teams, you are creating an additional SharePoint site. They broke from what they originally did in Teams, where you create a team and you get a SharePoint site collection. You create a channel in the team and you get a folder in your SharePoint site for that channel. You create another channel, you get another folder. all of the files live within folders in the SharePoint site. As soon as you create a private channel, you create a brand new SharePoint site, brand new security around it. It is hidden. It doesn't show up in your SharePoint Admin Center anywhere. It's not easy to monitor how many files are in there, how big it is, what's going on within that private channel. But there is that integration point between private channels and teams and between channels and teams, and a very subtle difference that makes a really big impact when you're trying to manage those files within teams. Another one of them is pages. This goes back to maybe we don't start in the browser, but we start in our intranet. You can start adding pages to Teams now, where these pages and Teams are just a page in SharePoint. It's another web page. It used to live in SharePoint. You used to navigate to it using your browser, opening up the page in SharePoint. More and more, just embed it in Teams. Let people live in Teams, have those pages exist, and then lists. This goes back to the last topic we talked about, where lists really are SharePoint lists. Lists and Teams are Microsoft lists that live in SharePoint. It is what it is. And it's one of those to be aware of that, again, when you're working with lists and Teams, it's just a Microsoft list that exists in SharePoint. I'm looking at time. Whoop, I don't want to jump to there. Let's take a look, because I do want to leave some time for questions. If you want to know more about calling, let me know. We can talk about it. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip to Yammer, email, and Teams. I get where Microsoft is coming from this. I'm still not sure I finally grasp it. I'm still not sure I'm 100% on board with it, but I understand what they're trying to do. This is a slide that Microsoft likes to use a lot to talk about how Teams compares to Yammer, compares to email. We've talked a lot about Teams. Files are stored in Teams. You do start having limits on Teams. This does not apply to a lot of organizations, but someone as big as Microsoft, where you are working with hundreds of thousands of users or tens of thousands of users, you cannot put everybody in the same team. Teams does tend to still work best where you are creating teams of people you work closely with, whether this is on projects, whether this is within a department, not necessarily where it is a group of all 120 employees or 120,000 employees at some place like Microsoft. This is where they would say Yammer comes into play, where it's a little bit more of a Facebook/Twitter-ish environment. Everybody in the organization is there. People post stuff. They can respond to stuff. They can have dialogues about stuff. Not quite as formal or as centric to a specific project or department as a conversation you might have in Teams. You're probably not gonna want to be in a team with 10,000 other people all trying to have conversations of what they're working on. Yammer is going to be one of those things. Hey, I'm having this problem. Is there anybody that has the answer to it? I'm looking for this piece of information. One of those where you don't necessarily know who to ask. It doesn't belong as an email blast to everybody in the company. You just have a question that you don't know the answer to or don't know where to go, and you want to put it out there and have a dialogue about it. And then, email's email. Email hasn't changed a whole lot. But that's kind of that differentiation between Teams and Yammer in terms of the types of conversations you have. At the end of the day, this is also going to boil down to, it didn't used to be the case, it is now, a Yammer. I don't even know what they're called in Yammer. Groups? I think it's groups within a network. Groups in Yammer, communities. All right, communities in Yammer create a Microsoft 365 group. You get a SharePoint site. Your files in those Yammer communities are going to be stored in SharePoint. So just another one of kind of those fine integration points in terms of how that content works together and how that content is stored. We already talked about that. Moving on to tasks. I am not going to cover every possible location that you can store tasks within Microsoft 365. My slides are acting up. There we go. There's a lot of different locations you can do it. I'm going to kind of cover the big couple. Tasks and Teams. This used to be Planner. Now it is Tasks by Planner. Shortly, it'll be Tasks and Teams. This is an app in Teams that gives you the ability to roll up tasks from Planner and from Microsoft To Do. I am hoping that we'll start seeing others surface in here. Maybe a way to get tasks from Outlook into one of these. You can have tasks, in Azure DevOps. You can have tasks in Project Server. But for now, Tasks and Teams is an app that gives you that roll-up of both your tasks that are assigned to you in Planner, as well as those tasks that are in To Do. I have started using this more and more. I love the Tasks app in Teams. If you don't have it, if you're not using it, go check it out, especially if you're using To Do in Planner. Because it does, going back to allowing Teams to be that central place to work, it brings your tasks in with your files, your conversations, all of that. One-stop shop for all of those tasks, for your files, your documents, your conversations. Planner is team task management. This is not project management. If you need full-blown project management, go get Project Server. That is still a thing. It's still in Office 365. It allows you to do your resource allocation, to manage resources, to do a full-blown PMO, project management type functionality. What Planner does is it gives you a board, it gives you a set of tasks that can be associated with those Microsoft 365 groups. It can be added as a tab in Teams, and it gives you a place to manage all of the tasks for that Microsoft 365 group. If you think of a group for a project or for a department, and you just want to manage tasks for your team, what has to get done, who's assigned to what, go check out Planner. You do have that option to put all of these in Teams, to create a Planner tab in Teams, to have your own Planner standalone app or your task standalone app that ties into Planner. It has mobile apps, iPad, iPhone, Android tablet, Android phone. This is not also going to be a personal task management. It's going to be managing those tasks as a team. One thing I love about Planner is if tasks are tied to certain documents, it allows you to attach documents within the SharePoint site that's associated with the team, the Microsoft 365 group, the Planner app, to these tasks. So on this slide, you can kind of see some of these cards that may have documents associated, may have images associated with them. It really gives you a central place where, because it's embedded with it, or it's the permission for it is done with the same Microsoft 365 group that also permissions your team and your SharePoint sites. It really brings that integration together for managing those tasks related to that team. Outlook in To Do is your personal task management. This is where tasks are going now if you flag emails in your Outlook. They will get created as a task within To Do. This also has a mobile app. You can access it in Outlook. Shortly, it'll be on the Outlook desktop app. This is turning into that central management for your personal to-dos. You also can run into a bit of a dilemma, or it could be nice, depending on how you look at it. To Do is also starting to pull in tasks from Planner that are associated with you. So if you want to see just your tasks, maybe not the entire team's tasks, you can use To Do on your mobile app and view your personal tasks as well as tasks you assigned in Planner, or you can use that Tasks app in Teams that we talked about that are pulling in these to-dos, these emails that you flagged, and giving you kind of that alternative central place to manage all of the tasks that are assigned to you, especially now that they have that Tasks app in Teams. So that has gotten a little it's gotten a little interesting how they have those two associated, but that association is there. So that wraps it up. We have about 8 minutes left. Contact information, feel free to email me. Feel free to shoot me a message on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle, my company's Twitter handle, the podcast Twitter handle, all of those websites again. I will jump over to Teams now and move this to my other screen so I can see the chat. I know there was a question earlier. Rocky, save for the end if there is time. When a mail user gets blacklisted as a spammer, does Microsoft share that information among tenancies? Why do some users seem to get blacklisted very frequently, and what is the limit on unblocking them? To a certain extent, I would say yes. Some of this there's not a ton of visibility into in terms of when an individual user gets blacklisted. The tenancies, you kind of have those standard blacklists, right? Like when a domain gets blacklisted as spam, it tends to kind of trickle down to everybody. You're going to run into a couple different things here where you can have your own, you do have some of your own controls within your own tenancy in terms of blacklisting certain domains or reporting certain email as junk. And they'll also look at, well, if I reported this as junk and somebody else reported it as not junk, one man's junk's another man's treasure. You could run into some of that with some of the email as well. So you won't necessarily always see it being consistent because there's just so many different variables that go into it. And that's also why you may seem to get some users blacklisted quicker. Why there's different things with unblocking them. There just tends to be a lot that goes into that blacklist that it's not always possible to understand how it fully works or what's going on. So hopefully that makes sense, answers that question. Beverly had to run. In the local Teams app, does the calendar change depending on the team you have selected in the left pane of the Teams or which you are a member? No, it does not. So in Teams, that is actually just looking at your Exchange calendar. So if let me just drag Teams over, not that Teams. This Teams. So here's my Teams environment. Here's my calendar for today. So this is really just pulling my Outlook calendar. So if I'm over here in Teams and I'm looking at general or any of those, this calendar is always going to be my personal calendar. It's going to pull from my Outlook calendar. If I add an event, if I would go in here, and you can actually see I have multiple calendars in Outlook. So this is on a different Outlook calendar, which is why it doesn't show up in Teams. But if I were to go into my Outlook, add some new event, and give it some test, save, this will actually show up now. Once Teams refreshes, there's sometimes a little bit of a delay there, but it will show up here on my Teams calendar because, again, it's really just pulling from that Exchange calendar. There's not... It used to be more so where there was a Teams calendar. There's still a shared mailbox that's driving it. Technically, there's still a shared calendar there in the background. It's really not surfaced anywhere in Teams in terms of that calendar. You are starting to get that ability to do so you still have the group calendars associated with the Teams. You can use those. You can surface them in SharePoint. Microsoft just rolled out too the calendar view on a Microsoft list. So you can also do lists and have calendars there and put those lists within a Teams. But that's that's that interaction here between the calendar and between the team. We'll see. Yeah, there's test up there now. So that's how that works. Hopefully that answers your question as well, Rocky. Anybody else have questions? We still have 2 or 3 minutes left. Thanks for joining me for this presentation. If there are any other topics you are curious about around the Microsoft Cloud, drop a comment below or hit me up on my website linked below in the video description. Also on our website, we have a free weekly newsletter available, as well as a Getting Started with Office 365 email course that you can find those linked below or by heading over to our website. And finally, don't forget to make sure this content continues by clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel.